Thanks all for joining. I'm going to run through some slides. I'm presenting really on behalf of a whole group of people who have done a lot of work on developing the revised conflict of interest policy, and several of them are on this call. You've just heard from Graham Smith, he's the project manager with EMD. Carla Suarez-Weiser is the editor-in-chief and the sponsor of this project. We're hoping Lisa Barrow will be joining. Lisa is the new research integrity senior editor. Fergus Macbeth, who will soon be stepping down, but is as of now still a funding arbiter and has been and so has worked on conflict of interest cases for the last 4 years with Cochrane. Funding arbiters will now be known as conflict of interest arbiters, and Maria Gerardi, who also has been supporting conflict of interest case management with Fergus, and Angela Webster, who's the other conflict of interest arbiter who couldn't join us this morning. Okay, so I just wanted to start with a clarification. I guess sort of working on this project for the last few years, we've got into the habit of talking about old and new, and I'm going to try very deliberately not to talk about old and new policy in this presentation, because this policy isn't new, it's an update or a revision. We have a policy, that's the 2014 commercial sponsorship policy, and and actually there was a policy before then. There's been a policy in Cochrane since 2006. So we've had we've had a conflict of interest policy for about the last 14 years. The commercial sponsorship policy is presented in a couple of places. It was historically on the community.org site, but also the sections of that policy, because it covered everybody and everything, all kinds of Cochrane activity. But the sections of the policy that were specifically relevant to Cochrane reviews were extracted and put into the editorial and publishing policy resource, also for short the EPPR. So throughout, I'll be talking about the 2014 or the 2020 policy. So we now have a revision as of 2020. Just a few words about why we revised the policy. We were asked by the governing board to review the policy, but in any case, any good conflict of interest policy should be revised regularly, and that had been built into the 2014 policy. And in fact, we were probably about a year behind in conducting that revision, but this revision was always going to happen because the landscape is changing. For Cochrane, having conflict of interest policy is a really key platform for us in terms of maintaining our reputation for independence and credibility. And also, if content that's created according to a rigorous COI policy can strengthen reader confidence. So that's something that is valuable to us reputationally as a whole organization, but also individual reviews. We hope can instill a greater reader confidence if they're based on a rigorous conflict of interest policy. Cochrane has always had a strong policy, and there are some things that haven't changed. Importantly, and this has been the case since 2014, Cochrane reviews can't be funded by commercial organizations that have a financial interest in the topic of the review. As far as authors are concerned, we don't permit authors who are employed by a commercial organization with a similar financial interest in the topic of the review from participating. We don't allow them to be authors. First, authors have to be free of all types of conflicts. So employment is only one type of financial interest, but there are others, such as receiving consulting fees, honorarium, speakers fees, travel grants, fellowships, etc. So first, authors must be free of all conflicts. That was that was so in the 2014 policy and remains so. And we have no threshold for financial conflict. So whether a person receives £500 or £5,000, we consider that to be a financial interest. If it's relevant to the topic of the review, then that counts, and it doesn't matter about the size of the financial interest. But there have been some very significant changes in this policy. The first is that we've narrowed the policy scope. So as I said, the 2014 policy covered all Cochrane members and activities, but much of the wording was really focused on review production, on the content of the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. So we made the decision as a project team during the revision process to narrow the policy scope so that it does just focus on Cochrane Library content. So this policy doesn't cover people who work in fields, in centres, it doesn't cover rules about colloquia or the central executive team or the governing board. Now, obviously we need a policy that covers all of those people and activities. So a companion policy is being developed through by the CET's governance and strategy team led by Lucy Binder. And until then, the 2014 policy still applies to all those other groups and activities. But this new 2020 policy is specifically about Cochrane Library content, and we define that as Cochrane reviews and protocols, editorials, and Cochrane clinical answers. Another important change is that we now require 67% or more, or i.e. 2/3 of the author team to be free of all financial conflicts. In the 2014 policy, that was a simple majority of greater than 50%. In addition to first authors having to be free of all financial conflicts, now last authors also have to be free of all those conflicts. And we've brought in restrictions on what role people can play if they've been involved in studies that are eligible for inclusion in the review. And it was always the case that people who had been involved in studies that were included in the review couldn't do any data extraction, but we've extended the rules around that. In particular, I think previously it was really just about data extraction and risk of bias, but now what we're saying is that people who have had that engagement in primary studies can't be involved in determining the inclusion and exclusion criteria. They can't make decisions about eligibility. They can't extract data, they can't carry out risk of bias, and they can't perform grade assessments on the study that they were involved in. And we've also created a new rule, which is that people who are have been involved in industry controlled trials cannot be first or last author, sorry. They aren't banned completely, but they can't be first or last author. We have the next slide, please. We've also now got a management strategy for cases that involve not-for-profit organisations that employ Cochrane authors or fund reviews in situations where it could be considered that organisation has a specific interest in the outcome of the review. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. This is acknowledging that sometimes not-for-profit organisations can exert influence that may be actually quite similar to that which people consider financial or for-profit organisations to exert. And in these cases, there's no outright ban by any means on not-for-profit organisations funding reviews or employing Cochrane authors, but in situations where a review group has some concerns, they should refer the case to the funding arbiter, to the conflict of interest arbiter and the editor-in-chief. We've We've clarified that Cochrane Review Group staff and editorial methods department staff should be free from relevant financial conflicts of interest. So specifically, anybody who is starting out, who's newly appointed, should be free of those conflicts. And for people who are already in post, if some financial conflicts do exist, then we're allowing people 5 years to divest themselves of those conflicts. And we've also added a clause about willful failure to disclose relevant conflicts of interest being considered a form of scientific misconduct. And this is in line with changes, I believe, in 2018 to ICMJE rules or recommendations about conflict of interest. So we're not talking about people making a mistake or here, but we're talking about people willfully, and this is authors, willfully concealing their conflicts of interest. We will consider that to be a form of scientific misconduct. Okay. What's been made clearer? We had mentioned in the 2014 policy, there was a sort of a very brief mention of what happens in situations where payments are made to an individual's home institution rather than to them personally. And we've clarified that quite significantly. And essentially, if people are not directly in receipt of the funds, if those funds go to the home institution, then generally, as long as that person does not have access to or control over the funds, then we don't consider that to be a conflict of interest. We've made clear the requirements for declarations of interest when a review is updated and when new authors are added. We've made clarifications about the timeframes in which conflicts are considered current. So the 36 months is the period. We haven't changed that, but in the previous policy, there probably was not really enough information about that timeframe. So essentially, the 36 months that we consider relevant is the 36 months before the title is registered, but also throughout publication. So if somebody acquires a conflict whilst the review is being produced or while it's underway, then that is also considered, that is relevant. We've clarified that a peer reviewer with a direct financial interest associated with the review can't be involved. This has been the case for a while, but it was a clarification that was made in the EPPR and not in the policy published on the community site. So this is simply bringing those two things in line. There's no change really here. And we've also clarified the responsibilities of authors, of Cochrane Review Groups, and of the Editorial and Methods Department, and I'll talk about that a little bit more.